Welcome everyone to the last class in our Planet Square the Nodes series. This is our July 2018 segment 1 class, and as you can see on your screen, we are finishing up with Pluto Square the Nodal axis. Many of you are familiar with the 3 different ways you can study with us here at EAN, from our weekly audio podcasts, which are free, to subscribing to the Astro Library, and of course to our EAN course, which you are all a part of segment 1 with. I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. You've probably heard it gazillion times. And so we do have a few slides that we are repeating in each class of this series so that these classes can stand alone on their own. The first one here is how evolutionary astrology works with all of the basic astrological archetypes. You will hear multiple times EA is based upon observe it and correlate it. Do not assume, do not make assumptions. Do not take it blindly on faith. Every archetype is going to have a spectrum of meaning, from the, extremes of the distortion to the best of its natural expressions. And you never know how that's going to come out. So you've got to be able to observe it in any chart you look at based upon your interaction with the person, if it's an individual chart, or observing the collective, if it's a mundane chart like a country chart. However, EA also looks at a planet, a sign, and a house as an interchangeable archetype. Some astrology will say the house is different than the sign, and that gets pretty confusing if you're a beginner to astrology. So for instance, as you see on your screen here, Mars rules Aries in the first house. The planet Mars, the sign Aries, in the first house are all the same archetypal principles, just like Moon, Cancer, fourth house, etc. With Mercury and Venus, we have an inner side of Mercury, an outer side. We have an inner side and an outer side of Venus based upon those signs and houses that they have double rulership over. So when you're a beginner to astrology, if you just understand the 12 archetypes, you will get those principles of the planet, the sign, and the house. So let's delve right in here to the archetype of Pluto, which is interchangeable with its rulership of Scorpio and the 8th house. We're dealing with the passive polarity, which is energy returning back to the center, the fixed modality, which wants to hold on, persevere, maintain, have security, and the element of water, which is all of the emotions. Now, one of the most basic principles of the Pluto archetype is that it is representative of the soul. And the soul has a dual desire nature. More on that next slide. But when we look at Pluto, representative of the soul, Pluto by sign is the generation that you were born into. And this generation will have similar karmic dynamics, and they will have similar generational lessons. And again, spectrum of meaning that you've got to observe and correlate, and you can extrapolate that into as well with the souls as consensus individuated and spirituated states of consciousness. And I refer you to webinars that we did back in early 2014 if you need more information on that. So there will be an opposite sign where Pluto is, and that opposite sign is going to be the generational evolutionary intent. And if you start to study EA, you're going to learn whether or not you're the Pluto in Virgo generation, Pluto in Libra, or you Pluto in Leo, it's the polarity Aquarius, etc. But natal Pluto by house then is going to represent that individual soul, and where that soul naturally gravitates to early on in life for basic security reasons. And it will then set up that opposite house as the individual evolutionary intent, the direction that the soul is intending to move in that lifetime. One exception is when Pluto's conjunct the North Node. When that's the case, the lessons remain in that natal Pluto house. The opposite house will have the South Node. There'll be energy from the past, but again, that evolutionary intent will remain the same. More information, refer back to the webinars that we did in 2014. In 2014, with segment 1, I shifted from teaching audio classes to video webinar classes. So I kind of went back to the beginning. And if you pay attention to the email that you've received, giving you the registration link for this class, you will see on there a link for the webinar listing. I think it's the webinar list of classes, and you can click on that and it'll give you a PDF of all the webinars 2014 through this webinar today in 2018. And you can take that PDF and you can download it and you can print it out, and it will give you the titles of all the webinar classes that when you go to segment 1, if you do not see them easily as you scroll down through all the webinars, you can just look for the search button, the magnifying glass, and you can search for a keyword or that title and you'll go directly to the class. So the dual nature of souls, basically comes down to separating desires, returning desires, and separating desires can be anything and everything, anything that's manifested. I want a new lover, job, car, house, purse, clothing, money. And we go through countless lifetimes in natural law, exhausting these separating desires. And as our soul expands in consciousness from consensus to individuated to spirituated, eventually we start to ask that question, why am I here? What's this all mean? And so we then start to look at the returning desire. Now, the returning desire is to know that from which we came, to return to universal source. And when we are evolving and exhausting those separating desires, eventually the returning desire becomes one desire. I want to return to evolutionary or to universal source. However, let me just say that we can use those separating desires on our path to return to source. One of the old teachings of Jeffrey is that in the consensus religious terms, we want to deny the flesh and the senses. We want to deny the separating desires and somehow pray ourselves perfect, the path of the monastery or convent. And what we've learned through observation, correlation, and natural law is that the path to evolution is the path of the householder. So we use the tools of the separating desires, the lover, the job, on our path to learn source, to know source. And so it becomes that attitude of how you're using the separating desires. You know, very few of us can deal without a house over our head. So we have a desire to have that nice home, but we don't see that desire as the be all end all that may be there in consensus world. As we're individuating, spirituating, while we have that nice home, we realize it's just the tool to give us some comfort on our path of returning to source. Make sense? Hopefully so. However, those dual desires to return and separate have the most intense conflicts wherever you see Pluto in your chart by sign and house, whatever planets or sign is on the cusp of the 8th house, and wherever you see Scorpio on the cusp of a house and any planets in Scorpio. That's where we go back and forth between I exist, I am, I want to be here, and what's it all mean? So Pluto is also the principle of limitations. We all have a past. We don't incarnate as a blank slate. So wherever Pluto is in our chart by sign and house, and of course, when I say Pluto, you can also add on Scorpio and 8th house. This is where we have to face the limits of who we are and who we are not. Some of us are born with a silver spoon and have more resources than we know what to do with. Some of us can barely get by, paycheck to paycheck. Some of us become presidents, some of us do not. Whatever the circumstances are, there's always a limit of what we are not. And so what happens is it creates the desire within us to transform any of these personal limitations and evolve beyond them. And the way we do that, it comes from recognizing sources of power outside of ourselves. And whatever those sources of power or power symbols are, we want to form a relationship with it or them, because by forming a relationship with it, we osmosis it into us and we become more than we were before. We evolve beyond that personal limitation. We metamorphose. Now, with Pluto, Scorpio, 8th house, the most common way we will do this is through intimate relationships. Why are we attracted to person A and not person B? Because we perceive they have something we don't have within us. Let me give you a common example. Leroy is late Pluto Leo. I am early Pluto Virgo. That difference between Leo and Virgo, Leroy and I talk about it all the time. My Virgo energy wants to, nurture and take care of all the details in any situation. And Leroy nature goes, well, somebody else will do it. So we're back and forth between him learning how to take care of some of those Virgo details and me learning how to Leo, let someone else do it. So that's just a common example. Of course, you take the whole chart into consideration when you start looking at relationships and synastry and why somebody's attracted to this versus that, or this person versus that person. So again, what we learn here then is this Pluto archetype includes this principle of power and powerlessness. And that experience of power will come from what we've already accomplished, the desires we've already achieved, what we've already become, what we know, what we've experienced. By that energy and experience through life and coming into the knowledge and security of something, it gives us a sense of power. That experience of powerlessness comes from that which we are not, that limitation. And we haven't had the experience yet. We haven't had the accomplishment of that desire yet. We don't know it. And so it makes us feel powerlessness by not having that in our world yet. So regardless of where you are on the evolutionary scale of expanding consciousness, you're going to have those areas of power and those areas of powerlessness. And again, with the powerlessness, you're going to be attracted to a symbol of power that you want to merge with in order to become more than you were before that sense of merging. So we will look at Pluto, Scorpio, and 8th house to show us where we are always going to be attracted to a power symbol we don't have, that we want to merge or unite with. This archetype also is the principle of attachment versus empowerment. So as I have a sense of explaining it, once you do that Scorpio or 8th house merging and you osmosis with something and become more than you were before, in natural law, you step back into the Taurian polarity of self-reliance, self-empowerment. And what has a tendency to happen here is we merge with that power symbol and we get attached to it. We can do the metamorphosis, but we can become very obsessed and compulsed with it. Pluto Scorpio 8th house is an archetype of codependency, because, oh, I need that power to be more than I was before. And what we've got to learn is to step back from that power symbol as we have incorporated it into ourselves, as we have become more than we were before. And what can lead to this principle of attachment with this power symbol or source is it is that need within ourselves to stabilize, because that dual desire nature and those separating desires, I exist, I'm alive, I breathe air, I've got to have a sense of myself, I've got to have a sense of that security, the fixed modality. And with the water element, it becomes an emotional security within the soul. I've got to stabilize it. It's okay to stabilize it. But again, do you become more and more attached, codependent, compulsive? Or do you go over to that Taurian polarity and become a new sense of empowering within yourself? If you go for that sense of empowerment, then you will empower others. If you stay in the attachment side of it, then you can fall into those traditional Scorpio symbols of needing to control and possess and manipulate in order to have a false sense of security, because you're too attached to that power symbol. Exception to the rule here, when that ultimate source of power is universal source. More on that in a moment. So what we will have happen then, if we're too attached to that power symbol and we become fixed within it and we stagnate in our growth and evolution, we will then run into the Pluto archetype that we call the principle of confrontation. And so sooner or later, something inner or outer is going to confront us and expose that limitation, expose where we're attached, and it's going to show us where the next evolutionary step of growth is. It's going to show us where we have to metamorphose again beyond a limitation and a sense of powerlessness that starts to come more and more into the picture because we're afraid to step away from whatever we're attached to. The intensity of this confrontation, or any confrontation, is going to be in direct proportion to the degree of resistance we have to metamorphosing or evolving, because that desire for separateness says, okay, I've got this relationship, or I've got this security of a job, or I have this security of something in my bank account, and I want it to just remain stable. And what we learn from the most basic law, the law of evolution, is that it's never static. It's always in a state of ebb and flow, evolving and growing. So if you can recognize these inklings of confrontation when they start to come up, you can make a conscious choice to address it instead of remaining stuck and resisting and blowing it up out of all proportions. And so when you look at these Pluto, Scorpio, 8th house confrontations, you know, one of the things that I will say with clients, it is a necessary part of your relationship. And what can happen sometimes in our consensus world is the confrontation means it's all over. Hell in a handbasket, the rug got ripped out underneath me, the partner left. And if we can recognize that the confrontation, to whatever degree, minimum or maximum, it's just teaching us where we've got to metamorphose, then you move to the other side of it. You move to the understanding of the lesson. You move through the metamorphosis and the limitation of that was represented, and you reach a new equilibrium. And this is a little bit hard for all of the fixed modality archetypes, which by signs, okay, is Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, Aquarius. Because that modality just wants to hold on. And so all 4 archetypes of the fixed modality run into confrontation, not just the Scorpio 8th house of Pluto. And so where do we see this more than the principle of death and rebirth? And this will happen figuratively. A relationship reaches a stuck point and a confrontation, an argument, discussion, whatever it is, to rebirth the relationship into a new area of understanding and interaction. And in today's world, it can be as simple as the traditional roles of male, female, what Jeffrey Green will call Betty Crocker, marble man. You know, I grew up with those. Younger generations are going, huh? Who? I have a Betty Crocker cookbook. It's an antique. But you know, to today, where the roles of defining who does what in a household, they're not so gender defined anymore. But we still have 2 people in a relationship reaching periodically, you know, those confrontations where, okay, listen, you're going to be the one who's in charge of cooking or laundry or vacuuming or taking the garbage out or changing the oil. And again, not so much gender based anymore. So we have those figurative death and rebirths, and then the literal one where we surrender the body and the soul becomes non-physical again. This is the ultimate surrender to the ultimate source of power. And then this brings up that principle of reincarnation, which is ruled in general by Pluto, Scorpio, and the 8th house, because it is the literal death and rebirth. And the whole journey of reincarnation and incarnating the soul into the body again, again, again. Its whole purpose is to eliminate any barriers and desires preventing emerging with source. Here again, you know, evolution takes place through the exhaustion of the separating desires. You don't exhaust a separating desire by suppressing it. By the way, the last separating desire to exhaust is sexuality. And in Jeffrey Green's EA teachings, he felt that, you know, only 1 to 2% of souls on the planet, most evolved avatars, have naturally exhausted the separating desires. And this is related to the polarity point, Venus, inner side of Taurus, 2nd house, and the desire to procreate the species. So the last desire to exhaust is sexuality. And so, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, exhausting the separating desires until the desire to know source and to merge with source and to be a channel for source becomes the only desire left. Now, Another thing that is a cliche that just clicked for me 35 years ago, that I just love, is another JWFG quote. Evolution takes place through the emotional body. And it goes back to that Garden of Eden myth separating spirit and flesh. Okay, spirit being the spirit and mental bodies, flesh being the emotional and physical bodies. You can have all the spiritual wisdom you can understand. You can have all the mental genius that you can be aware of. But until that spiritual wisdom and mental knowledge is experienced through the senses, you do not evolve. You do not incorporate it. And so this is why we have to realize that spirit and flesh are two sides of the same coin. And evolution takes place through the emotional body, which means evolution takes place through the senses, which means evolution takes place through the incarnation of the soul into the physical body, experiencing these separating desires to evolve, become more than it was before, and make that full circle back to source more than it was before it started. And that is also the reason why the unmanifest manifested in the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, in a desire to evolve and perfect itself. So, Pluto archetype is also the principle of inner cycle analysis, understanding why we are the way we are, who we are not. And so you will hear that Scorpio in the 8th house are the natural psychologists of the zodiac. This is because as we learn to understand those sources of power outside of ourselves and who we are and who we are not, and why am I in this situation versus that situation, it brings up that, famous question, why? And so we try to have some type of psychological understanding of ourselves, our world, and what's going on, and, why am I this? Why am I not that? And so here we can, specifically, and every one of these, 12 archetypes can be broken down into consensus, individuated, spirituated, okay? But consensus psychological knowledge is limited to self and your closest circle around you. All you've got to do is look out at the political landscape in the United States right now and, go, why can't these people recognize Don the Con saying everything spur of the moment, whether it's truth or lie, because it's what's best for him? He's not leading a country. He's in it for himself. He's in it for his self-aggrandizement, if that's the way you pronounce the word. So if you recognize that consensus psychology can't step outside space-time it was born into, it can't think back far enough or wide enough to, correlate larger understandings. Resorts into me versus you and us versus them. And that's approximately 7 out of 10 souls on planet Earth, any race, any country. And yet every so often we have that cataclysmic evolution come along and it shocks us out of our comfort zone, out of that, attachment to the power we have, and shakes us up and goes, oh, wait a minute. Oh my gosh, I didn't recognize that. And so the individuated state of knowledge, approximately 2 out of 10 souls, is where we're going to learn how to understand human psychology based upon an individual basis. And this is where we can start to extrapolate what's the psychology of being Black race versus being Hispanic race versus being Indigenous Native American race versus being Caucasian Northern European race. We can start to expand our psychological understandings and make an effort in which we start to apply them in different ways. Doesn't mean we still can't get stuck and defensive, especially when, security gets threatened, rug gets ripped out underneath us. But we keep going on that evolutionary journey of expanding then until we get to the spirituated state of knowledge. And this is where we learn to understand spiritual psychology that understands natural spiritual archetypes and principles, or what EA calls natural law, which we will find through nature versus the four walls with a book and an intermediary. And so this is very important then when you look at the Pluto house and you go through observe, correlate to understand where's that individual soul at, so that I can understand what their state of psychological knowledge will be. Pluto is also the principle of marriage type, intimate relationships. As we said before, that one-on-one intimate relationship with another. We're attracted to someone who symbolizes something that we do not have within us. We perceive a need that we have that we're not meeting, and we are magnetized, hypnotically attracted to an individual, and sometimes more than one individual, that we perceive has it and we don't. And so this again then sets up that situation of wanting to merge and bond, because we feel this relationship can transform us. Now, this is where sexuality comes in here as part of it as well, okay? But it's more than just physical sexuality. There's emotions, mental attitudes, and spiritual beliefs that come in as well. How many times have you been attracted to a spiritual guru and you just, can't eat up enough of their wisdom because you perceive them to be more spiritually evolved or more spiritually wise than you, and you want to learn it? So that, intimate relationship, well, yes, we can include marriage type relationships. It's not necessarily limited to that when it comes to intimacy. And of course, what this will then bring up as we merge, metamorphose, become more than we were before, we've got to also be able to step back or step forward into a new level of self-reliance, the Taurus second house polarity, with each time we merge to the partner. Because if we don't do that, we start moving into those distortions that come along in intimacy, where we manipulate someone to get our needs met. Jeffrey could sometimes call this the Black Widow effect. I'll be in relationship with you till I get what I want, and then adios, goodbye. It can go into emotional codependencies when we're not willing to step back into that sense of self-empowerment and self-reliance and who we are. And it can also then create what they would call the die-hard commitment. And the die-hard commitment is what is supported by consensus religions. Until death us do part. What God has joined together, let no man put us under, or whatever the phrase is. And so if it's reached the point where there's nothing left to learn in the relationship, we'll run into the outside attraction, the temptation, or one partner could literally die to help enforce self-reliance. And doesn't mean that the one left and the one that crossed over into non-physical, they can both have lessons in self-reliance, because you don't stop learning on the other side. But again, this is the archetype of intimacy, making a commitment to someone else, and through that commitment, metamorphosing, evolving, becoming more than you were before. And unfortunately, after thousands of years of patriarchal conditionings, we don't really have a good understanding of what commitment is in marriage type situations. And so in natural law, what is meant to happen is to choose partners who are willing to evolve and change as the need presents itself. So when the confrontation comes up, you meet the confrontation and communicate it, address it, see if you can move through it and reach a new state of equilibrium. Again, the intent, more and more self-reliance. However, in natural law, this will also include the potential that the relationship came to a natural Y in the road. Scorpio 8th squares Leo 5th, Aquarius 11th, Leo lovers, Aquarius friends. And in the natural wheel of the zodiac, friends and lovers is how we go back and forth with. Friends become lovers, and when they've learned the lessons, they go back to friendship. Now, if we have that Taurian self-reliance, then we can recognize with the whole death and rebirth principle of Scorpio that the Y in the road is not necessarily the bad thing. Beautiful, to me, to really be able to get that in the fixed modality of all places, can just really help us take a lot of pressure off intimacy when we minimize projecting onto that partner and become more and more self-reliant, especially through each merging and metamorphosis. When we do that, then eventually what we can create is the potential for soulmate relationships. Unconditional love. I love you no matter what, even if you perceive the best thing is the Y in the road and you want your freedom. Hopefully we love ourselves enough. I'll be hurt, I'll be disappointed, but I love myself enough that I'll still be okay. And so from the perspective of evolutionary astrology, the definition of soulmates is spiritual growth. There's a spiritual foundation to the relationship, and the entire reasoning of the intimacy is for both people to spiritually evolve. They still have karma, they still have confrontations, they still have, things that come along, but they have a spiritual foundation to fall back on in order for the relationship to evolve and grow. And so finally, just to say this separately from intimate relationships, because you don't necessarily need that to have sex with someone else. Tinder app, anybody? Which I still consider to be a distortion of the patriarchy. But the Pluto archetype is the principle of shared sexuality or sexual bonding with someone. Orgasm is, I think if I remember this correctly, Latin for little death, the whole death and rebirth of the sexual release, that buildup of emotional sexual energy with the fixed modality, that metamorphoses into greater understandings with the literal act of shared sexuality with someone else. Now, Ye feels, thinks, that from a spiritual perspective, when we share sex with someone, we take on the karma of another when sexual fluids are shared. And so I have a tendency to say in relationship astrology, before you're intimate with that person, just take a look at them and go, do I want their karma? And it can help you make a more considered choice whether or not to jump into intimacy or not with them. And on the most sacred level, sexuality can be the most sacred act there is. There's a reason why we have the two genders. We learn, there's the principality of the male psychology and the female psychology. And through the merging of the two, we can become androgynous. We become whole as we are evolving and expanding in consciousness. And of course, what we're starting to learn here, I see it almost as a, let's call it further lessening of all of the patriarchal distortions. You know, the higher purpose of homosexuality is androgyny. Learning to love the soul first, body second. You don't have to be opposite genders to have a deep sexual bonding and union, or to have an exchange of the sexual fluids. And yet, again, in natural law, as we are exhausting the separating desires, and the sexuality desire becomes, you know, the last one to exhaust, we start to realize the most sacred thing we can do is to bond with another human soul. And can we do it in the utmost of respect for another? Stay tuned. Let's see if this, you know, whole, what do you say, LGBTQ wave moves us in that direction in some ways. Okay, so that is my archetypes for Pluto, Scorpio 8th. I'm going to take a drink. Any questions or comments? You can bring anything up. We're not going to go back to those slides we look at every month before we have a chart example. All right, no questions. Oh, saw the Q&A thing pop up. Question? If it's simple, Leroy answers it on the board.
Yeah, it's just a question to discuss Pluto retrograde, and maybe you can address that briefly if you'd like.
In generics, Pluto retrograde. I can't remember. Have I done a series on the planets retrograde? I don't know if I've done a webinar series on that. I got planetary pairs down for the fall series, but I printed out the classes. Leroy, we made those notes on that this spring, Leroy. We got to go back to those to decide my next series this fall.
We
Again,
have some retro
Pluto
stuff. I'll research that for us.
Yeah, you know, Pluto retrograde means we've been resistant to every one of these principles we just talked about. And so if you're born with Pluto retrograde natally, you can't ignore what we just spoke about to this point. You've got to be throwing off limitations. You've got to be open towards the confrontations and metamorphosis because you've resisted it in the past. So coming in with Pluto retrograde natally is just going to emphasize it even more, that you have got to, you know, address the limitations and metamorphosis within your own soul. So it will intensify every single one of these principles that we've spoken about here. Okay, moving on. And nope, our example does not have Pluto retrograde today. I'm going to go through these slides a little fast because we've looked at these every single month with this series. All right. Nodal axis, north node, south node, points in space where moon's path intersects the plane of the ecliptic, which is the sun's parent path around the earth. North node, moon's path crosses above the ecliptic. South node, moon's path crosses below the ecliptic. Here's the visual, okay? Here's the moon's path on the dotted line going across the sun's apparent path and going above it, north node. 2 weeks later, here's the moon's path going below the ecliptic. Here's the south node. So it's the intersection of the moon and the sun's path from the appearance on Earth. Twice a year, they are lined up with Earth, and we have eclipses, which we are in the middle of right now. And so the nodal axis recesses or precesses, moves backwards around the zodiac, signifying a return to universal source. Nodal axis is retrograde 90% of the time. If you're born with the nodes retrograde, you get a sense of your destiny earlier in life. If you're one of those 10% born with the nodes direct, that sense of destiny can come later in life. And that was the case with myself, born with the nodes direct. Nodal axis takes approximately 18 months to move through any sign of the zodiac. When we look at the South Node archetype, this is the soul's ego from the past. It's the accumulation of all the emotional residues from all our past lives. And we say ego and emotions because we're dealing with the moon, which is the main archetype in astrology that deals with the emotional body. So, South Node represents security. It's what's known. It's from the past. Karma on all the 4 levels. It is a point of familiarity, both positive and negative. Positive, it can be gifts. Negative, it can be the Achilles heel we've got to relive. It can also be the point of stagnation. It is the prior mode of operation on emotional levels in which we lived out that prior karmic dynamic or natal Pluto by house and sign. To flesh that out, you will also look at the aspects the South Node makes. You'll look at the ruler of the South Node by sign and house and the aspects those rulers make to get a whole complete picture of the ego of the past with the South Node. The North Node is the leading edge development of the soul's ego in this life, the emotional growth and evolution forward. It represents insecurity because it's unknown, uncharted territory. It's dharma. It's the future going forward. It has a sense of destiny or a magnetic pull towards it. It is a point of movement. And it is the current mode of operation on emotional levels that our ego is striving towards to allow the evolutionary intent or the Pluto polarity point by house and sign to be actualized. And you flesh out that evolving ego of the soul, the North Node, by the aspects that the North Node makes. How many aspects? You look at the planetary rulers of the North Node by sign and house and their aspects, and it's going to flesh out all the details again of how the ego is moving forward and helping the soul learn whatever its lessons are in this lifetime. Now together, the nodal axis, the past and future, or South Node and North Node, are always in the tension of the present moment. And you can look at this natally, and you can look at this by the transiting nodes and transiting moon. Both are active, and they're active with each other, and they're all going on at the same time in each and every one of our charts. What we have to remember here, though, is that the past is always trying to shape the future in the present moment. And because the past represents security, there's a tendency to always project the past forward for security reasons. You know, doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting to get a different result doesn't happen. And so, therefore, that retrograde mean motion of the nodes can represent progressively leaving the past behind and moving forward. So that retrograde motion of the nodes is helping us break free from the past South Node and moves toward the future or north node. Now, here's how we determine aspects to the nodal axis with planets. Regardless of the planet, you always compare the nodes to the planet. Whether we're talking Uranus or Neptune, slower moving planets, or we're talking Moon or Mercury, faster moving planets, you start with the planet and you compare the nodes to the planet in a clockwise direction. Because clockwise, reversing through signs in zodiac is how, signs of the zodiac and houses is how the nodes move. So 2 examples here, Uranus in the north node, you see there are a conjunction, but you start with Uranus on this outer green circle, and you move the nodes all the way around the circle to get to the north node. North node is a balsamic conjunction to Uranus. If you look Uranus to south node, you start with Uranus and you get almost halfway around to get to the south node. The south node is a gibbous or waxing opposition to Uranus. So again, one more time, the nodes are compared to the planets. So you start with the planet, you go clockwise to the node. And for those of you who go back far enough, I ran Jeffrey Wolf Green School from 2002 to 2008. And one of the first things that we did, there was another EA grad, Adina, bless her soul in spirit world. She literally went back through Jeffrey Green's old message board up to that point and referenced every time he spoke about planets and aspects to the node or nodes and aspects to the planet. 70% of the time, this is what he said. And so that became the rule. Skip steps. This is the subject matter we're looking at today. You start with the planet and you go clockwise till you get to the node. And so in this example here, we do have Pluto square the nodes. And you see the symbol for the node here. And you see the purple line. And so Pluto is exactly 16 degrees Virgo, reversing through the zodiac to Gemini, which is square Virgo. At 22 degrees, it's less than 90 degrees. So the nodes are applying squares to Pluto, which means there's a tendency to have a buildup of skip steps when the nodes are applying squares to the planet. This blue line here, if the nodes were at 16 degrees, there'd be an exact square. There'd be all the tension of these skip steps coming into consciousness with that planet square the nodes going, oh gosh, I feel myself torn in two. I've got to figure this one out. If you go to the green line and we go start with Pluto and we go all the way back to 12 degrees Gemini, there are separating squares. It can mean it's possible there was another lifetime in which we dealt with this skip steps issue, or we are a little more inclined to be able to resolve it because we understand that energy easier than if it's applying squares. Also, what we can look at here is when a planet is square the nodes or nodes are square the planet, that planetary energy goes back and forth between those two nodes. We have to look for the resolution node. And in this case, in this example, it's the node that last passed over the planet. Here it's the north node. So planets square the nodes, as we said just a minute ago. Both of those nodes were active in creating karma in past lives. So not just the south node, but also the north node contains the karma of the skip steps. And when a planet is square the nodes, that planetary archetype is stuck. Its development is arrested, and it goes back and forth between those nodes. When things get too hairy-carry or scary with one node, it jumps over to the other node. So both nodes are involved with the karma, and yet both nodes have had some prior experience, so there can be some level of Oh, I get it. So again, to evolve through the bouncing back and forth that we call the skip steps, that resolution node. So here's the description one more time. Start with the planet, go clockwise to the first node. That is the resolution node in resolving the skip steps. If the resolution node is the south node, that planet and its archetype must be resolved through consistent application via that south node. It means you must go back. There's something that must be readdressed. There's something that must be redone again. You've got to go back and clean it up. And then it allows the north node to actually evolve and move forward. If the resolution node is the north node, then that planetary archetype and its skip steps, its stuckness, must be resolved through just going forward, going forward, going forward. That becomes the bottom line. And in that moving forward consistently with that planet through the north node, that south node itself will be metamorphosed. And if I can, a side point in general here, okay? You know, south node, it is the point of familiarity. We all know it. As we strive to go towards that north node and develop it, developing the south node, the north node, excuse me, developing the north node in general, then metamorphose the south node in general. Again, we move forward into the future, and it allows that past to be healed. It allows that past to be metamorphosed in and of itself. Now, I put this in every time, which is the cycle of phases and aspects, which I got at the very beginning of my EA studies. Jeffrey Green adapted this from Dane Rudier's work. If you're familiar with him, he was a French humanistic astrologer. His books were so astute that they're still in print. And so, you know, this is the way that EA interprets aspects between planets. It's phase first, aspect second. The aspect is contained within the phase. And I've seen more and more and more general astrology adopt this over the last 30 years of my experience with evolutionary astrology. So I started out with this, and it's one of my specialties in teaching because it helps take a lot of confusion out of interpreting aspects. And by the way, I think it was the 2014 classes, but if you go back to that webinar listing of classes, you will see where we did a 5-class series on each of the 8 phases and aspects within. And then there was a class on math review. I tell you to go to the math review class first. I taught it last. Hindsight here. But I put this in because I've kind of a little differentiated from some of Jeffrey's teachings. Jeffrey felt that every planet should be compared to the sun because the sun's the center of our solar system, and without its life-giving energy, nothing would be here, which is true. And if you want to practice EA that way, by all means do so. Over the last, I don't know, half dozen years or so, I've started comparing the personal planets. I remain comparing personal planets, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars to the sun. But over the last half dozen years, I've started comparing the sun to the outer planets. And it's all my years of doing forecasts and just coming at it from this geocentric or Earth-centered perspective. And so for me, I compare the sun to Jupiter on out. Now, to give you an example here with this, if we compare Mercury to Pluto, Pluto is the slower moving planet. Planets move counterclockwise. We start with Pluto. We follow this inner circle all the way to Mercury. Mercury is a balsamic conjunction to Pluto. If we compare Pluto to Venus, again, we start with Pluto. This little short green circle here, Venus is new phase Pluto. It's just 1 degree past a 10-degree conjunction. I use wide orbs. But if we want to look at Sun compared to Saturn here, I now start with Saturn, follow this outer green circle all the way around, and Sun is balsamic phase Saturn. So I have clarified these PDF sheets to just what works for me. You don't have to agree with this. You can go with Jeffrey's original teachings. You can adopt this. You can, however it works for you, observation correlation. Okay, so that's it for the nodal axis synopsis and the aspects little review. We're ready to go into our chart for today. Questions before I move on?
All clear.
Okay, I gotta take a drink of water. Leroy, we do not have a live volunteer today. She's working, although she is patiently waiting to review class. I've known this volunteer for quite a long time. She is from the Northern Plains like me. And so we have a tendency to see each other almost once a year. And when we do, it's yak, yak, yak astrology. But we also have known each other for almost the last decade with deep memory processing, Roger Volger's past life regression therapy, and that's what we have a tendency to exchange with each other whenever we get together. And so we've learned each other's charts over the years. As you can see, this person was born in Omaha, still in the Midwest. She had 2 parents. This is a female example. Mother is now deceased. She has a younger brother and sister. She was raised lower middle class, a lot of Protestant religious upbringing. She was expected to get married, be the wife and the mother. Didn't have any career guidance from the parents. She did get married to what she called mother passive aggressive. She called her ex-husband passive aggressive, and he was an alcoholic that she divorced after 18 years, but had 4 children with him. She went back to college after her divorce. She's a technical writer, but she's quite active in social justice politics. And so she has, I couldn't remember if she's been married 9-10 years exactly. I could be off a few years on that, but she now is in a second marriage, and this was someone that she actually knew and dated for almost a decade and a half before they even married. So they knew each other quite a long time. Describes husband as somewhat self-centered and self-focused, but it's been good for her in speaking up and standing up for herself. So this volunteer has a Virgo rising at almost 4 degrees. Pluto is here at 0 Virgo 08. That's pretty early Virgo, and I'm 2-degree Virgo. So I have this group of EA associates I know, and we're the early Pluto Virgo club. Pluto Virgo in those first few degrees, yeah, we're bond. And so if we start with Pluto here, and by the way, I'll point out Pluto's rulership, Virgo by sign, is Mercury down here in a balsamic conjunction to Neptune, Libra to Scorpio. Pluto's ruler by house is Neptune. So the 2 rulers of Pluto, the soul, are in a balsamic conjunction down here in the 2nd house as well. Pluto, if you start with Pluto, remember we start with the planet and with the nodes, we go clockwise. The first node we run into is the South node. So the south node is the resolution node for Pluto square the nodes. Now, and as you can see here, the nodes are stationary retrograde. There was a question on the Segment 1 Facebook group, which, by the way, for anybody who listens in the future, if you want to be a part of the Segment 1 Facebook group, you have to send me a friend request. I cannot just automatically add you to the Segment 1 group. We have to exchange personal friend requests. And so Kim Marie Weimer, Rapid City, South Dakota, send me a Facebook request, and then I'll accept and I'll get you added to the Segment 1 Facebook group. However, there was a question about the node stationary retrograde and stationary direct, okay? Now remember, the nodes naturally go retrograde. So when the nodes are getting ready to be stationary retrograde, which is the case here, it's like the nodes are finishing up a retrograde and they're getting ready to move forward, and they're moving forward as backwards. So it's like moving into the sync of the nodes retrograde. If you're born when the nodes are stationary direct, it's like the nodes are getting ready to do a retrograde cycle. And so it slows it down and intensifies it more. So the node stationary retrogrades, the nodes moving stationary retrograde is a little bit easier than the nodes moving stationary direct. Again, you have to take the interpretation and make it just the opposite of what the planets are. When a planet gets ready to go retrograde, we all know how frustrating it can be. So when the nodes get ready to go direct, it's the opposite of their usual movement. It intensifies and is frustrating. When any planet gets ready to go stationary direct, we're done with the review. We're ready to move forward. That's what the nodes stationary retrograde are doing. And the reason it's stationary retrograde is because it's red. If it was an S and it's black, this is solar fire software, it would be getting ready to go direct. So Pluto's 0 degrees, the nodes are 29. The nodes are 1 degree past Pluto. They're separating squares, okay? It's still 1 degree orb, so it's pretty tight, but it's just past the separating, so there's something that's going to maybe work a little smoother with the ahas and understandings than if the nodes were 3 degrees Gemini and they were applying squares to Pluto. Ruler of the south node by sign is Venus over here at 24.5 Virgo, tight new phase conjunction to Jupiter. Ruler of the south node by house 10th is Saturn. And looky here. Here we have the ruler of the south node by house conjunct north node. Interp come in just a minute. Let me now just point out that the ruler of the north node is Pluto, the soul itself, by sign. And the ruler of the north node in the 4th house is the moon, which is in a new phase conjunction to Uranus over here in the 12th house. Both rulers of the north node, Pluto and the moon, in the 12th house. Rulers of the south node in 1st and 4th. So what I want to say, when Pluto is square the nodes, there skip steps within the development of the soul itself. It means that the soul itself is stuck. And if Pluto was retrograde, it would intensify breaking free from being stuck or arrested. In this example, Pluto is not retrograde. And so if we would look at Pluto, the early degrees of Virgo, you know, this is a soul who's come into self-improve. It is, you know, the bottom of the pyramid. Everybody can do it better than me. I'm just that, you know, little pea gravel in, you know, the midst of the sand on the beach. And 12th house, and it's the tail end of the 12th house. Virgo's polarity is Pisces, so you've got Pluto in the opposite house of the sign it's in. You see how the Pluto, or excuse me, the Virgo Pisces axis is just accented here by Pluto alone. All right. And so what we have here is a soul that has been surrendering to source. Now, knowing this volunteer as long as I have, she is, definitely moving into first spirituated. Still works mundane job, but again, very active in her spiritual, and on today's world, the social justice, active in wanting to bring healing upon the planet. So there's a lot of surrendering that can go on here. What could happen here is that the soul is surrendering some of its own identity. I'm trying to, be of service so much, make amends for whatever karma I've come through, that this could be a soul who's almost lost, some sense of identity. So that could be one of the possibilities of where it's stuck. How does this soul evolve? I exist. How does it merge with source without doing the distortions of the patriarchal conditionings and becoming the masochist? Okay, becoming the rug that everybody steps over. The rulers right here, okay, will intensify the energy of this Pluto signature in surrendering to source, okay? And yet what needs to happen here is grounding. I've got to be in my body. I can't just float. The 12th house Pluto square the nodes could, be floating off in space. And, this volunteer, in early time periods did have, some substance abuse issues, and, walked away from them to really get grounded in herself. The other thing that could go on with this signature that will then could become some of the skipped steps, okay, is the fact that these two rulers, Mercury, balsamic, Neptune, Libra, Scorpio, to the partner having more power, surrendering to the partner being in charge. Stand up for myself, rulers of Pluto in the second house. Now, if we start then to extrapolate that with Pluto square the nodes, the skip steps within this soul might be, how do I merge with source and still have a sense of identity? Because even in first stage spirituated, we've not exhausted the separating desires. We still exist. We still have to pay the mortgage. We still have to eat food. We still have lessons to, resolve in relationships that is reiterated by the rulers of Pluto being in the relationship signs. So if we have some of that, we start to bring in the nodes here, okay? And as we can see with the nodes in Taurus, Scorpio, this will then emphasize that there might be skip steps in intimacy and relationships. If we have Pluto square the nodes in 4th and 10th houses, can the soul have skip steps in regards to its development through the family of origin? And so there can be efforts by the soul made to be self-reliant, to take charge of its own life, Taurus 10th house. But there can also be situations with the North Node in which there was codependency and emotional neediness, Scorpio in 4th house. I have a tendency to say when I see nodes in 4th and 10th, especially if a planet skips steps, oh, you were the parent or the child, but you haven't learned how to be the fully functioning adult yet. And so this could be a soul, okay, who would bounce back and forth between, you know, trying to take charge of its life, but being codependent. You know, wanting to grow up and not wanting to grow up. Having over responsibility, you know, having to take care of 4 children and a husband, or lifetimes in which I want you to take care of me, you know. So there could be skip steps with emotional arrest and development here. Now, because I have done deep memory processing with this volunteer, what there was a tendency, what a pattern we would bring up time after time again within this soul is shutdown or victimization. You know, the soul just, you know, not being in the body, 12th house Pluto. It's too harsh to come out here and actually live in the actual world. And lifetimes where she wouldn't survive as a child, or lifetimes of very controlling partners, and she would, you know, have a tendency to shut down, give up. Oh, I'm just gonna, you know, go back to spirit world. I'm gonna kill myself. That was one we, you know, one regression we brought up. And so remember, Virgo is an earth sign, and at 0 degrees Virgo, this is a signature of getting in your body, Pluto by sign. And to be in your body as you are resolving things on a spiritual basis, whatever that evolutionary state of consciousness will be. And so for this specific example with this soul, you know, it's being able to Virgo analyze all of the patriarchal distortions, and yes, wanting to know source, merge with source, but wait a minute, even again, first stage spirituated, I've got to be practical. I've got to find natural, you know, no wonder she's attracted to evolutionary astrology. I've got to be in my body and walk a spiritual path in the human world. I can't be stuck off in the, you know, in the monastery or in my little isolation. Now, here's a little interesting tidbit for you. For those of you who know Patricia Walsh, she took over Roger Wolger's deep memory processing work. And what she would always say about Pluto square the nodes in her practice, because it's the soul, you know, it's the depth of existence on a soul level. Pluto square the nodes, the soul could make the littlest decision, and it turned out to be a life or death choice. And so Pluto square the nodes, everything becomes life and death. Remember the death and rebirth archetype? And so Pluto square the nodes under any sign or house can bring the soul in a state of almost paralysis. I don't know what to do. I mean, it's a life or death choice. And so sometimes there needs to, be breath work for the soul. It's okay. You're not going to go off the deep end. This time it is different. And, this was literally the case with the soul and some of our deep memory processing work, little decision and boom, they were gone. Now, bouncing back and forth between over responsibility, under responsibility, fourth, 10th, between all of the many things we can have going in intimate distortions with Taurus and Scorpio, you control me, I control you, betrayals of trust, love affairs, the triangles, those types of situations coming into the picture here, okay? The resolution node is south node. So there's something about the past that this soul must go back and readdress. And if you look at the south node in Taurus 10th, and here's another double earth signature. This soul must go back and readdress self-reliance and taking charge of their own life. They must get in their body. 12th house Pluto. 12th house Pluto square the nodes. I don't want to be in my body. 12th, remember 12th house Pluto's? It is too mean and cruel to be on planet Earth. I don't want to incarnate here. I don't want to be here. I'm just going to check out. I'll check out through substances, or I'll check out through fantasy, or I'll check out through not being in my body, 0 degrees Virgo. I'm not in touch with myself. And so what they are having to go back and really get here is being in the body and living in a space-time world. And whatever their soul is needing to do in its next step to merge with source, they have got to do it through the body, through the senses, through being in touch with the emotional body, Pluto, ruled by water element, 12th house, ruled by water element. And so they've tried to do that before with this north node, but they haven't always accomplished it. So they've got to go back, south node, resolution node, and really get in the physical body, take charge of their own life, which this person has been doing left and right through their deep memory, past life regression work, and using the tools of astrology at the same time. And then, of course, the ruler of the south node house is Saturn and conjunct the north node. So to go back and resolve this past and get in their body and walk a spiritual path through the physical body, and then taking charge of their life with the ruler Saturn conjunct the north node, it will lead to an emotional maturation for this soul. And so it, again, allows them to mature and become that functioning adult on a deep soul level, which is something that they are really striving and needing to do. And so in the body, in touch with the senses and the emotions. And then, of course, this allows this Pluto polarity point to become activated. They are, again, 6th house polarity point. You've one foot in front of another, being in touch with your world, being in the physical world, and yet Pisces polarity also working with their spiritual development while they are physically here. And it then allows them to be of greater and greater service in the world. And that's exactly what this volunteer is doing. She has, found herself to be getting, again, more and more active in politics, and yet from the perspective of social justice.